Thank you, Pablo. I'd like to invite my fellow panelists to come up and join me. We have Quemuel Arroyo, Chief Accessibility Officer of New York's MTA, Biagi, Commissioner of the Chicago DOT, Christian Henry, Senior and General Manager of Cubic Transportation Systems, and Eileen Velez-Vega, Secretary of Transportation for Puerto Rico. Hi, thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Today's topic is the brave new world of public transportation. To introduce myself, my name is Sarah Kaufman. I'm with the NYU Rudin Center for Transportation. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a research center at New York University focused on contemporary issues in mobility. Most recently, we put out a study about actionable solutions to improve safety and caregiving issues for women on public transportation. But today, we have a fantastic panel talking about the future. I think it's an understatement to say that the last 2 years have been brutal for public transportation. But I will say that things are starting to look up, at least in New York. Even though during COVID, transit ridership declined up to 90% in 2020, we're back up to 60% of original ridership. Just last Thursday, we had 3.3 million riders on the subway system, which, for those of you keeping track, is about double the number of people who flew around America on the same day. So we do have an opportunity to take this crisis and make something new out of it, thinking about what we could do to make public transportation more accessible, more equitable, more sustainable. What can we do going forward? So I'm very excited to hear from these panelists about their ideas. But first I want to take a moment and commend all of you and your organizations for making it through the last 2 years and the essential work that you have done in moving people around, especially the frontline workers. And so let's start off by way of introduction. What is something that happened over the last 2 years in your organization that you are especially proud of or that you're hopeful about? Gia, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you. So I'm Gia Biagi. I'm Commissioner of Chicago's Department of Transportation. We work hand in glove with the Chicago Transit Authority. So think of my shop as the tabletop. It's all the assets, all the stuff, the streets, the sidewalks. We build the train stations, but it's also micromobility. So we kind of go, I'd say, from potholes to policy, right? Maintaining the system, connecting people to their transit system, and then developing the policy structures for good things to happen. And so, just I guess, something that we're particularly proud of having done during the pandemic was we actually dug in and developed a strategic plan for transportation that centered mobility justice and economic justice and racial justice at the core of what we do. So really taking the time when crazy stuff is happening and saying we're actually going to talk with each other and with some of our biggest critics about the future. Because I think during COVID, part of the challenge is if you don't pick your head up and imagine that there's a future, it feels like there isn't one. And so I'm really proud of not only the team in my department, but activists who worked with us, other departments, to say, how do we recenter around what we're facing together as a society and create goals, strategies, tactics, and of course, metrics to get there.
Great, thank you. Eileen?
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Eileen Velez-Vega. I'm the Secretary at the Department of Transportation and Public Works in Puerto Rico. And as you all know, Puerto Rico has had some interesting past few years. I would say about 5 years. It'll be 5 years from Hurricane Maria in September. And from then on to earthquakes and then the pandemic, our department, our infrastructure has gone through a lot of challenges, a lot of optimism, but also we've had to come back from all these events. So I'm especially proud of the way that the team has been working through all the different challenges, being able to restore the infrastructure, because we're still in recovery. If all of you visit Puerto Rico today, it is different than 4 years ago after Hurricane Maria, but we're still recovering. And so hopeful for the future, we have a lot of these recovery funds available that had to be obligated, and that took a while. It's FEMA, it's FTA, it's Federal Highway, all these different funds, all these different opportunities now that we have. And it's not just for transit, even though transit has a lot of the funds available, but in the Department of Transportation, we have 7 agencies that include the Public Works Directorate, we have the Puerto Rico Highway and Transportation Authority, we've got the DMV, so we actually have that part under us as well, and then we got mass transportation, which is the train, we've got the Metropolitan Bus Authority, we've got the Maritime Transportation Authority, and all these different modes of transportation have had a lot of challenges. We're hopeful for now having funds available to recover, a lot of resiliency projects that are coming in. We learned from all these different events that we weren't ready for this type of event, of atmospheric events. And what are we going to do now from this point over so that we don't go into the same stop mode pretty much that we had to do? And it's not just the infrastructure itself, but how do we improve the service? And you were talking about racial justice and everything like that. We have a lot of, our mass transit is localized to the metropolitan area. We depend also on the municipalities, on inner city buses. How do we connect to the municipalities and provide that mass transportation for other communities, not just the metro area? So hopeful for the future that we can invest some of these funds that we have available so that we can expand the system and also offer better service to all those that are not necessarily living within the metro area.
Thank you. And I think we'll dive more into the equity question in a moment. Christian, let's hear from you.
Hi, everybody. Christian Henry, Senior VP and General Manager of the East Region for Cubic. Actually a position I've recently moved into, but have spent the last 4 years overseeing Cubic's rollout of the Omni program in New York. So I'm part of the New York takeover on the stage here. But I think that in terms of the last couple of years, obviously what we're very proud of what we've been able to accomplish in New York with the Omni system. At the end of 2020, we completed the rollout of the 6,000 buses and close to 500 subway stations, all amongst the pandemic, all amongst a shutdown in which we actually accelerated the installations and put our validators on all doors of all the buses in preparation of future all-door boarding. But I think most recently what we've been able to bring that will really hopefully help to improve those numbers on returning ridership is the implementation of the fare capping, which previously, for any that have visited New York or are familiar with how the Metro card operates, that was a card-based system that would require purchase upfront of time-based passes, whether they be weekly passes, monthly passes. About a month ago, we implemented fare capping with the Omni system, where now using your own credentials, your own card, a phone, or an Omni card, which you can purchase through some of the out-of-network retail locations, you can use that in a pay-go scenario, and if you hit that point that you hit the value of the cap for the Metro card in the week, you will receive free rides from then on. And I know the MTA's marketed it, that 13 is your new lucky number, and I think that it's really started to take off and help with the return to work that we're seeing in New York. So we're very excited about that, and just kind of the opportunities that having an account-based system in a location like New York allows us to do more of these creative solutions to help with the ridership and the overall plan going forward.
Thank you, Christian. And I know that fare capping, at least for me, is a game changer, and I think a lot of New Yorkers are really excited about it. Quemuel, let's move on to you. What are you proudest of or most hopeful about coming out of COVID?
Thank you so much, Sarah. Quemuel Arroyo, really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I am most excited for the MTA initiative to redefine what accessibility looked like at the MTA and for our riders. Really stopping with that old notion that accessibility and disability were analogous or synonymous, really, and redefining access to all of our clients. We have over 130,000 births in New York a year. That's 130,000 strollers hitting the pavements, coming into our transit systems with parents and caregivers who also need access into the system. Over 1.5 million New Yorkers over the age of 65, And they know what I know, that our public transportation system is the most efficient and fastest way to move around the city. So redefining accessibility, delivering access in that 2-year term of COVID, cumulative what was done in the last 2 capital plans at the MTA. So really using the terrible pandemic time as an opportunity for us to get out there, access our systems, access our stations, and develop the new accessibility that we wanted our customers to experience. Absolutely what you heard before, Omni, partnering with Cubic, and again, our partners, our partnership will deliver the best payment fare that New Yorkers have ever seen before. The tokens were fun, but left a lot of people behind. MetroCards quite didn't get us there. Omni will deliver that access that so many New Yorkers and tourists need, being able to utilize all their whatever digital wallets they have, or being able to tap. Yes, the MTA is tap friendly, and we want you to tap in and through our systems. Lastly, we are changing what our fare rate looks like. We are working with Cubic and others to install wide fare gates, which will deliver access to people coming from JFK, parents and caregivers with strollers, people with bags who just don't fit through the turnstile. We're giving them that access starting this fall with a pilot and expanding it later on to really provide that accessibility that so many people need and have been talking about. So I am really excited for all these changes at the MTA and for a future diving deeper into real-time information and access to that real-time information for all of our customers, both in the system, before the system, so that they know what to anticipate when they get to that bus stop, to that train station, and of course, during their experiences. So a lot of access redefining and service delivery to be seen.
Thank you, Quemuel. And you bring up such an important point that transit is not just the service from station to station or stop to stop, but rather the entire door-to-door journey and the experience of travel. And thank you all for sharing these more optimistic viewpoints and for all of the accomplishments that you have somehow achieved over the last 2 very difficult years. So thank you. I do want to take some time to zoom in on some of the topics that were brought up during these discussions. And the first is that across America and specifically transit agencies, there's been a sharper focus on equity and what that means. And equity tends to be used as a catch-all term to mean any underserved person, but it's not very specific. So I'll start with you, Eileen. How do you measure equity? How do you define it and measure it in terms of transit service? And then how do you judge whether your initiatives have been successful?
And we have a long way to go. We've been working currently, and I've been at the department for a year and about 4 months. And when we started, there was a lot of feedback from the users on the limitations of the system and the routes as well. So something we're starting now, it's pretty much on the planning and development process, are the routes that we have for the Metropolitan Bus Authority and for the train, are those the most efficient? Have they changed in the last few years, especially after the pandemic when a lot of the behavior changed and how people are now working remotely from home? Or how are we actually accessing these areas where people are getting where they're getting service? And so one of the things we're doing is analyzing the routes that we have available and if they are what we need. One of the things that we looked at when I started as secretary was the information available for the user. We have the issue that if you stop in one of the bus shelters to pick up the bus, and I did it just to see how I was going to move around, I didn't know where I was going. And I was like, okay, there's no information here for me to know I'm here in point A and I'm going to point B, but it's really point B where I want to go. And so what we've done is work with the Metropolitan Bus Authority, and it's called AMA in Spanish, and we're developing the pretty much like wayfindings, but also information in the bus shelters so that people know where you are and where you're going. We're now adding names to the routes, like the university route, the shopping route, the bank route, the tourism route, so that more people can use it, because we've noticed also that the service and the ridership is limited. So are we providing enough information and orientation to whoever can use the routes so that they can rely on the system and also get to where they actually want to go? It does serve a lot of low-income families, And we've seen that, but also there's a lot of universities and commercial areas that can be served. So why aren't these people using it? So why aren't we going out there and doing more education so that people know how to use it and where they have to go? So we're starting from education, very ground up, because we really had to start from zero. And so we're actually now creating the infrastructure so that people know where they're going. We're starting with innovation as well. We're having apps developed so that people can actually know when the bus is going to arrive, how you can connect to the train and get to where you want to be. And also with fare collection, that was something that we also have to restore now after the hurricane and after everything we've gone through in Puerto Rico. So the way that we can measure it, once we develop all these programs that'll be available next in this year and beginning next year, is then see how our systems are actually improving, or what did we do in order to increase ridership, but also to let people know that they can rely on the system and get to where they actually want to go. Because it's amazing to me when I started that was a question. It was like, do we even know where we're going or how to use the system? So we're starting from the basics to actually improve and better the equity and also just the service that we're providing.
Thank you. The wayfinding piece is so important in usability of transit and often underestimated. So thank you. And Gia, I understand you've been doing equity work in Chicago as well. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. And I think you do, initially you posed a really interesting question about definitions. And I think that does really matter. I mean, you can sort of say, equity is about getting what you need, right? That it's not the same for everybody. And I think operationally, we've kind of gotten society to a point where there is understanding of that, so that's something. But to me, sort of equity, it's like a verb, not a noun. You're not arriving and we wake up and we're like, we did it, we have equity, right? It's always going to be shifting and moving as we have these different touch points with people and needs change and the economy changes and all kinds of things. So thinking about it in that respect is important. And in Chicago, we try to use frameworks that help us to assess, well, what does internal equity look like within your organization? And then what does it look like externally? And it falls into a couple of categories of procedural or process, structural, distributive, and then sort of cultural, which is really the hardest part that you're trying to get to, right? Hearts and minds, and really about moving the needle, let's say, on that kind of a policy question. So some of the examples that we have in Chicago, I mentioned our strategic plan for transportation and how we recentered. And one way we did that was through what you might call it sort of more procedural equity, which is we helped to pay for our largest conglomerate of advocacy groups who are our biggest critics, who are not always in agreement with us and call us out on things. We paid for them to get engaged in our strategic planning. So we helped stand up something called the Transportation Equity Network. That's over 30 groups that are both neighborhood-based, they're also citywide, reflecting kind of that systemic scale viewpoint and then sort of that 1 foot level, hyper-local, on my block understanding. And so we said, would you come in the tent just for a minute, tell us what we're doing wrong, tell us what we're getting right, and then tell us what are the equity challenges we should be taking on. So what we did with that kind of processual or procedural kind of equity act was to then incorporate that into our strategic plan. So we have verbatim what that group was saying we ought to be working on, and then a call and response between that idea and that vision of the world and actual goals and strategies. So on that side, that's something that we're continuing to work on. We can always get better at how we listen and respond with communities. On the kind of a structural distributive side, one of the things that we developed as part of our capital infrastructure program, where we went it alone before the infrastructure bill was passed, when it was a twinkle in everybody's eye, but nothing had happened. So we got about $1.5 billion to Chicago Department of Transportation to start doing that longer-term legacy infrastructure improvements. And so in order to make that an equitable distribution, we developed something called the Mobility and Economic Hardship Index, the MOBEC. And so what we did was look at equitable distribution of mobility across our city, knowing that it is very spatially segregated, and taking that as part of the factor, but looking at where does it cost a lot to move around the city, how much time does it take you to commute, and then how hard is it for you to commute, thinking about populations of people with disabilities or seniors, or are the sidewalks good up. So that becomes a distribution across the city. And so we're going to highlight those areas. You match that with economic hardship, and I will stop talking, I promise. But you match that with economic hardship, and then we're able to really target areas of the city that we can make a difference. And so here's what we did with that. That's distributive, right? So that's how our bridge program, sidewalks, concrete, all the way over to our bike share program and our scooter program that have equity rules for rebalancing the system and that distribution. We've embedded that. So now I have, we figured this out, and now it's a way of doing business. So everything that we do across the city is run through that filter, and you get points and weighted criteria for being in a neighborhood that tracks with mobility and economic hardship.
That's brilliant. I love your comment about equity being a verb, not a noun, and being not a finish line, but a touch point. And I really appreciate that you're paying advocates for their time, and I do think that that's a growing trend, and it should be growing, and I applaud that because people need to be compensated for the time and energy that they're putting into these efforts. So thank you. A lot of really interesting efforts, a lot of really interesting initiatives there, so thank you for sharing. I do think that one really interesting way that we're looking at equity and more usability and accessibility of systems is through technology, harnessing technology. And as we look forward, it's obviously playing more and more of a role every day. So Quemuel, I would love to hear from you how you're looking at technology as a way to improve accessibility in transit.
Thank you, Sarah. So to start, I'll say during the pandemic, we saw that a lot of our riders, particularly our railroad riders, were apprehensive of coming back into the system because they didn't want to come into a packed train. So one thing that we did was we deployed a new plugin to our railroads application, letting all of our riders see in each car how dense those seats were, how occupied those cars were, so that they knew exactly where they could find a seat where they weren't around so many other people. We're now using that same level of information to deliver accessibility information to persons with disabilities who may have a wheelchair or scooter, or parents with a stroller who will want to know where there's space allocation for those devices, so that again they're not entering into a crowded train. And also when they're exiting that train, we're now delivering geospatial information about where the elevators and escalators and other facilities in our stations are for those clients. Again, giving them access to information that they need to make that transit experience what they would like to have. In addition, I said earlier, we're really using technology to deliver information to persons with disabilities, letting them know about the elevator and escalators service throughout the system in real time, so that when they get off the train and encounter a broken escalator, it's not a surprise to those clients. There's an alternate route that's been delivered to them, and they know exactly where they need to go, so don't even bother going to that escalator that you used to use. Really giving information out in real time in all modes, announcements, visual boards, and push notifications to people's devices. Really leveraging all the tools that we have at our disposal and what our riders are using. A lot of our riders tell us, we're not looking at your website, so find another way to communicate with me. So we're being really responsive. We're listening to our clients, and we're really understanding what their journey is and demystifying that there really isn't a bespoke rider out there. Every rider wants access to real-time information, and they want no surprises on their journey. So we're doing that for all of our customers. I'm really excited to deliver that same level of transparency and access to information to our paratransit customers. Now, we rarely talk about that, but in New York City, we run the largest paratransit system in the world with over 28,000 trips a day. That is a huge business, and we're looking to enhance it and do a lot of the things that we're talking in this panel and at this conference of being innovative for that demographic as well. When I was at the Department of Transportation, we did some surveys with our regional partners and learned that aging New Yorkers are indeed using mobile devices. So we can communicate with our aging New Yorkers, aging population through a smartphone. That means that we should and are working towards delivering transportation as a service via a mobile device for a paratransit user or a senior who also leverages a paratransit system, or who just wants to know what's happening in the network so that they too can move around. We always say in New York is an amazing city, and we want our residents to age in place. I get it. We all love the weather here in Miami, especially if you're from Chicago where it's snowing. But we also want to tell people that they don't have to go. they can age in place because we are creating a system that will meet their needs where they're at. And I think technology is the perfect tool to help us bridge that gap.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Q, because I plan to live out my days in New York City, and I'm glad you're going to make it easier to get around. Christian, one thing that you've been working on is making it easier to get around, and as Quemuel said, is demystifying the transit experience. And one way you're doing that is by making the payments process easier. Can you talk more about how you're making transit more usable by everyday New Yorkers and how that impacts how people are getting around?
Yeah, definitely. So I think we've all experienced anytime we're traveling outside of our home base and we arrive in a new location, just the uncertainty that comes with that is, how do I get from point A to point B? But not only how do I do it, what's the mechanism? I have to buy a card, I have to purchase tickets, it's weekly, it's pay as you go. I think that the more we can normalize that across the board, the more it's going to help everyone. And if you take New York as the example, and what we've done with the open payments there's nothing there that's earth-shattering. It's a little bit slower coming into the U.S. as it's been overseas, and that's just in general with contactless technology. And when we went forward in New York, it was a little bit of a risky play because we just didn't have that penetration into the market of people that had the credentials that they could use. There was the ability to load into phones, and like Quemuel said, that balance between people with and without phones is getting closer, but still there needed to be a way to be able to get out to the people that they could use what they already had to get around before they actually had that in their pockets. So I'm thankful to the brands, the credit card companies that really supported us, helped with the advertising throughout the system, and have really made that more of an option for people to use that system. And now going forward, now that we've really kind of broken through that initial barrier from a full fare perspective, now it gets back into the equitable conversation of, well, what are we doing about the people that don't have credit cards, the unbanked, the people that don't have phones? How do we give them all the same opportunities that those folks have? And that's where we're looking to leverage things like the retail network to bring sales beyond the bounds of what the system has, where you don't have to go into a station, finding a vending machine, standing in line at a vending machine, which nobody loves to do. But if somebody is taking a bus into work or school, that they've got an ability to go to their local bodega, pharmacy, and purchase what they need, still pay with cash if they choose to do that, and get all the same benefits. One of the things that we're working with the MTA on right now is pretty revolutionary too, and is expanding that open loop concept beyond the bounds of just the full fare customers, the people that are paying the $275 per trip. As Quemuel said, there's 1.5 million reduced fare riders within New York, and if we can expand that program out to them where rather than those individuals needing to go and get a specialized card to use the system, they can use their own credentials and really enjoy some of the same opportunities that we've been able to give a lot of the other riders. That's going to give everybody the opportunity to take that journey beyond their home base, where now, if they go to another city that's offering open payments, they can now use that same card or that same device they were doing, and not worrying about carrying a wallet full of cards across bespoke systems in a card-based technology. And I think once you start working off of that account-based system, obviously it gives you a lot of opportunity. You start looking at first and last mile, work with the bicycles like we were talking about, tying that in potentially to road user congestion pricing that's being looked at in a lot of different cities, and how we really leverage all of that. The biggest thing is if we can make it simple for the customers to understand how to use the system, they will use the system. It's making it intuitive and making it in such a way where they don't have to make an upfront commitment that they're really not so certain of. The power users will always be there. The people will have their habits, and people will be paying, for their month up front. People will be pay-go. Everybody has kind of their roles, but I think what the pandemic has shown us is once that normal day-to-day activity gets disrupted, there are a lot of different ways to travel with mass transit, and we just need to be sure that we're providing offerings for all of those individuals if we're really looking to get the ridership back the way that we want.
Thank you, Christian. Those are great points, and also I'm looking forward to paying for a slice of pizza with my Omni card. I do want to switch gears and talk about the last couple of years have not just brought about the challenges of COVID, but also public transit has really borne the brunt of the impacts of climate change. In New York, we had plenty of flooding. In Puerto Rico, and then, of course, in other parts of the country, there were wildfires. So public transit has really had to kind of answer for this larger problem. And I want to turn it over to you, Eileen. What are you doing to bolster your transit system against climate change impacts?
Right. So this is of an interagency effort. It's not just DTOP with the Department of Transportation, but we also have a climate change committee that's also working with the Department of Commerce and Development, Economic Development, because all this affects development, and it also affects everybody's way of life, its quality of life. So within DTOP, we have different projects for the different modes of transportation to increase resiliency, and those are actually recovery projects from the hurricanes. But also, we work with the Public Works Directorate, and we've actually met with the union that was worried about the flooding that happens when there's intense rain, or the condition of the pavement after we've had these incidents. So we actually sat down Public Works and the Metropolitan Bus Authority and the union workers, and we went through different areas and all the routes, looked at the routes, what are the sensitive areas, the vulnerable areas that we have the flooding or that we have issues with paving condition, and what is the investment that's needed. And so we're working with both agencies to improve the conditions of not just the roads, but also the pretty much the manholes and everything that we have to do in the area that either does it have to be raised, do we have to do an HH study, do we have issues on some vulnerable areas where we just have to fix the system, is it working? So we've had to do this interagency so that the projects and the capital improvement comes from the Public Directorate, with the Public Works Directorate, but also within all these modes of transport, the agencies have recovery projects that are gonna be implemented. And for example, with the train, one of the key areas after the hurricane was electricity. We couldn't work the train because we had no electricity. In some areas, we didn't have electricity for 6 months. You can't just shut down your system because you don't have electricity. So what are we doing in the next, hopefully we won't have another Maria in 100 years or never again, but there is a cogeneration and a resiliency project for the train that is going to improve that situation when another issue like this with electricity happens again, and that is going to help us. We also have that for the stop at the traffic lights around the areas within the cities, and how do we increase or implement solar technology so that we have resiliency and backup when we lose electricity. So electricity is a big deal in Puerto Rico, as you've heard. So that is something that we are improving and implementing in the different modes of transportation. But definitely our infrastructure, as well as roads and the hydrology and everything in the hydraulic systems, has a lot to do with it, and just providing better routes and better infrastructure for these areas that are using, where the modes of transportation are being used. As far as massive in areas like maritime transportation, where it also connects to all the modes of the buses and the trains, we're also improving that by providing better service to the outer islands, because we do serve municipal islands that are outside of the main island of Puerto Rico. So it's pretty much how do we develop these projects now that the funds are available, so in the event of another catastrophic hurricane like what we had 4 years ago, that we don't fall in the same challenges that we have with having no system available to serve the different communities. So definitely we have now the funds available to improve and to plan better for what might come.
I'm so glad to hear that. Sorry. Along those lines of climate change and climate-based improvements, I think that we can draw a straight line from America's overdependence on cars to the impacts of climate change. But what the people on this stage can do is help reduce America's reliance on cars. So how do we do that? How do we get people out of their vehicles? How do we turn the choice riders who have the option to drive in their climate-controlled vehicles everywhere they want to go and get them to see the appeal of transit or bikes or scooters? And which would make a safer and more sustainable environment throughout. I'm wondering, Gia, this is something that you focused on. Can you talk about it some more?
Yeah, no, excuse me. I'm glad you asked, because I think, when we do say choice riders, we, I think, have to recognize, and I think you do, that it's not always a simple choice, right? That there's the attitude that maybe folks who have a lot of options in transportation-rich areas can say, oh yeah, I can pick and I choose this. But we have a lot of folks in Chicago who don't have that choice. We also have a lot of folks in Chicago, about 30%, who don't have a car. But they still have to get to work. There's still those long commute times. And so I think as we're thinking about the choice and the attitude and those kinds of questions, I also just want to be clear-eyed that we have a lot of areas that really need to have the choices right there. And I think that's where the heart of the matter is. How do you make it as easy as possible, as affordable as possible? How do you reduce all the friction that you can between a person and this alternative option? And so we're really focused on mode shift. And so by doing things like building out our bike infrastructure. When I walked in the door about 2 years ago, we had about 300 miles of bike lanes. Now we have 400, right? That's an exponential increase. That 300 took 12 years. We're not waiting. We're rolling it out as fast as we can. We're also doing things, though, in a community-based way. So to focus not just on the commuting trip, I think we all know the stats, like most of your trips are not commuting. They're going to the neighborhood store, they're bodega, right? Because New York is here, so we'll say bodega. The 7-Eleven in Chicago. Or they're going to the park, or they're going to school. And so we've really reset our bike planning around what are the meaningful destinations in your everyday life. Because it's not just changing how you decide to get to work, it's changing the culture, it's changing the way that you decide to move around. So not only do we have those deep, hyper-local conversations, and we're building out these set of neighborhood nodes, and it's easy to connect the dots on the map. It's much harder, though, to spend the time with people who object to that kind of infrastructure. I have had city councilmen, and I won't say who laid on the ground in front of my machine that was painting bike lanes because it was against bike lanes. Or, one, would you please get up? Two, we don't want to run you over, but three, let's talk about this. And so it might seem very easy to folks who care, and I care a ton, I'm a cyclist. Yes, we just want to get the protected bike lanes out there, but it's a much harder question if you're willing to engage with people and know that, it's slow, but slow is smooth and smooth is fast, and that's how you can get there. So the other piece, so there's the infrastructure piece of developing those options. I think there's also, in removing barriers, we have our bike share program that my department runs. It's called Divvy. And we have an equity program there as well. And so if you're income qualified, it was for $5, you get a year of free bike share. It's not free, it's $5. But so I announced last week, we're going $1 a year. So $1 a year if you qualify. And we're raising the threshold because, being 30% of median income, there are a lot of folks that are above that, but who still need the help. We're also giving away bikes. We announced we're going to give away 5,000 free bikes. We don't have it all figured out, but we have a lot of it figured out. And that's also, boy, what a barrier. You don't have to have bike share. I'm going to give you a bike. I'm going to give you a helmet. I'm going to give you a lesson. I'm going to, we're going to track and see, back to that mobility and economic hardship map, did we get a mode shift? And you spoke earlier about, how do we measure, right? We'll have those outputs, that's easy, miles and numbers and that sort of thing, but it's the outcomes that we'll need to track. And so the challenge here is how to have some patience too, right? Trying to figure out, are we moving the needle, and then adjusting. And, I can keep going on the bikes, but I also, want to this is a crowd, it's EVs, right? I was talking to my friend Gabe Klein last night. I'm like, what's the hot topic? Oh, it's electric vehicles. Great. I don't actually care what it is that walks in the door, but I want all of you who want to come to Chicago and get that on the ground, and we do too, to think about the values, to think about the where and the who and how we're moving the needle. Then you can come in with whatever widget it is, and we will help build that infrastructure. But we have to get, as a city, our values right and clear so the best, most innovative things can come our way. And then we're lifting up the whole city. We're moving that needle, not just counting up the numbers of EV charging stations that we have and cars on the street, but we can see the change for the long term.
That's fantastic. What an amazing set of programs that you've developed, and I hope every other city that's here is going to follow suit. And later we can discuss how people are biking through the winter in Chicago. But
They do. It's no bad weather, only bad clothing.
Quemuel, you've worked on this from another angle. How do you get people on public transit? How do you entice them to take transit when they may or may not see it as their best option? And so we've heard about the micromobility side from Gia, and so I want to hear about the public transit side from you.
Well, I also want to say in New York City, we're a little different where we, the MTA, run our transit systems, but the Department of Transportation runs the sidewalks and the streets infrastructure. So I think a big answer to that question, Sarah, is collaborating with our partners at DOT to ensure that that first mile, last mile has been met so that we can attract more people to our railroads, to our transit systems. You know, there's a lot of New Yorkers for whom public transportation is the only option that they have, and that could be enhanced by looking at that first mile, last mile, micromobility solution that's going to bring them to do more frequent trips because they're going to have a better experience in however it is that the city decides to deliver that. That's one way of getting more people into our transit system. For drivers, I really do think that we have to work in tandem in New York as one transportation provider and sell the value proposition of mode shifting and using more economic friendly, but also environmental friendly modes of transportation. I think there are just way too many vehicles in New York City servicing one individual person. It doesn't make sense when our transit system runs 24 hours and the head times are getting shorter and shorter every day. So we're doing everything that we can from our perspective, incentivizing people with things like the 13th ride being the free ride, innovating paratransit, and creating a more accessible system so that people can come back to a system that looks different than what it was when they left because of COVID. A system that's more responsive to their needs, but also a system that they can engage with. And I think that's a topic that we haven't hit on yet. We need to open our doors to our clients to say, we want to hear from you because a lot of us are everybody in this room, I'd say, is overeducated. We have a bunch of solutions, but at the end of the day, if that doesn't move the needle to the client, to our riders, then none of it matters. And the only way for us to ensure that we're delivering the solutions that we want to see that will entice people is by asking them, why aren't you riding this train? Why aren't you getting on a bus? And we are working with the Department of Transportation and this new mayor in New York City, Mayor Adams, to really move fast on building more bus lanes, more busways, enhancing the bus experience, working with our partners in other agencies to help us solve some of the issues that we're facing today that go beyond mass transit, beyond the transportation component. People are using our infrastructure for a lot of other reasons, and that's something that we need to address and work with our local partners to help us provide for that need that is in transportation, but that is being conducted in the transportation scene.
Thank you. I like the kind of two important points that you brought up. One is stakeholder engagement, that there needs to be more of, and the second is collaboration across jurisdictions, which tends to not happen enough, but I'm glad that you're working to make it happen. At this point, I want to invite the audience to line up at the microphones to ask questions, and people can also submit some online, but I am going to ask one final question of each of our panelists, and then we'll get to audience Q&A. So we've been talking throughout this panel about how we can look forward to Transit 2.0 or the future of public transit. What is one major change that you think traditional transportation planning and operations, what is one change you would like to see to set transit up for the next iteration, the next service level that can be provided in true 21st century service? Gia, I'll start with you.
That's a big, heady question. I was like, maybe I could go last on that. No, I think I circle back on, if making sure that what we're doing in transit, that it is connected to a set of values that reflects the needs of the most marginalized folks in our communities. You think about, you talked about engagement. We're often talking to folks who have both high power and high stakes, like if you have that quadrant up there. But we're often not talking with folks who have no power and high stakes at the same time, right? And so I think the question is, if we can continue to do a better job of getting folks who don't have power but have high stakes into these conversations, then we're going to get it right. Because if you design for the margins, the middle does fine anyway, the center does fine, the tent goes up. So that's a future that I'm hopeful for, and that we end up moving the needle on those big public policy questions of reducing hardship and injustice wherever we can.
I love that. Engage the people with no power and high stakes. That's a fantastic takeaway. Eileen?
So I think that for us, and if you've noticed, and I've noticed with us up here, Puerto Rico is a mode of recovery. And there's a lot that there's a lot of way to go before we can implement a lot of the innovations that you all have in your cities. So for me in the future, we definitely want to be able to have this innovation so that we can provide these services to people. But also, I'm from the west side of the island when there is no mass transportation that can get me there because most of it is focused on the metro area. So in Puerto Rico, we need to provide, if somebody wants to come from the west of the island to San Juan or to wherever else, what do we have to do to be able to provide that to them? We have complete streets guides that are approved now. We have cycling and pedestrian plans that are now part of the Strategic Highway Transportation Plan. The future for me is being able to implement all the guidelines and the projects that we have there. We have funds available, but we also need to develop the plans to get us there because in the past, because the funds weren't there, there was a lot of limitation on what we could do. Well, that's not the case now because of all the challenges that we've had. But how do we focus this so that we are focusing on the real needs and what we really need in the island? The cultural side of changing the way people use the cars, Puerto Rico is totally dependent on cars. I think we're per capita or per region highest in the world with ownership, of car ownership. 4 cars sometimes per family. A lot of congestion as well that we deal with every day. So for us, the ideal would be people being able to to take the bus, to take the train, to use their bikes. We are implementing bike lanes in the metro area and other municipalities. Collaboration between municipalities through the MPO is something that we're working on and improving, and also citizens' participation so that we can listen to them. I liked where you were all talking about surveys as something we want to implement in all the modes of transportation because we feel that we know what's needed, but we see it on social media that sometimes we miss the mark. So there's a long way to go and a lot of improvement, but we're here to listen. And the biggest thing that we brought in this administration is change and innovation and communication, improving the communication with those stakeholders, with the users, and how are we serving them, what has not worked in the past. We have funding available now, so let's make it happen. So definitely for me, I see a bright future of us being able to serve not just what we're doing now, but how do we do it outside of the island so that if a tourist also, and we're so focused on tourism, if they want to go to the other side of the island, they don't want to rent a car, can they actually see Puerto Rico without having to rent a car? And how can we get there? Still have a long way to go, but definitely the stage is a lot better than it was a few years ago.
I like that. I like the idea of starting out your planning process with two-way communication. So that's excellent to hear. Christian?
Well, in the fair payment space, what I really hope to see is just a continued shrinking of the physical footprint. I think that if you look at how a lot of the funding has gone for the major programs out there, it's a lot of upfront capital spending to help on the reduction on the operation side. It's fewer machines to visit, fewer cash collection runs, fewer paper, plastic stock that's out there. If we can really push more out to the edge, and I think we sell vending machines, but nothing would make me happier than to see people stop using those and using other offerings we have out there that are more mobile-based or card-based on something that's already out there in the world. Because I think if we can get to that point, we address a lot of the topics we hit today. That's helping climate change. Fewer paper tickets being left on the side of the road that have been discarded, fewer truck runs that are out there, and it can be done. If you look at the Uber model, there is no physical infrastructure there. It's everybody's carrying the phone, and then what we need to do is how do we translate that model that has worked away from the cars and back to the mass transit. And unfortunately, we can't have the trains go and pick people up on whatever corner they're standing. But if we can simplify it for them and help them with that journey and get them to that that point using the micromodal, at that point we've really achieved that objective. And I think a lot of these things that we're trying to collectively achieve up here, will come to fruition.
Christian, I like how you're thinking through how every detail factors into the larger themes we've been discussing, so thank you. Quemuel, bring it on home. What is one major change you'd like to see going forward?
One major change that I'd like to see going forward, and really I hope it can stick, because we've been talking about it with COVID and since, it's really designing for those with the highest needs. For far too long we've been focusing on flashy innovation that services a couple 100,000 people. But at the MTA, we're in the business of moving 6.5 million people a day. So I really need solutions that move the needle to my most vulnerable user, because that is the only guarantee that I have to ensure that all my riders are benefiting. And a system that doesn't meet the demand, the needs of those vulnerable people, it's not going to be a sustainable system, because you're going to have to change. You're going to have to, put in different things, different plugins. You're always going to be retrofitting, and that is not a sustainable mode for mass transit. So I'm really looking to continue to invest in folks with the highest needs. And one way that I want to remain, and we saw it with the pandemic, is not forcing people to come to a in-person, in-room conversation to engage with us. So I'm talking about digital engagement, which TfL was doing from the get, way before any of us were talking about it. And I want us to continue to engage with our riders in their mobile device, from their homes, late at night, in surveys that they can take whenever they have a 5-minute lunch break from their blue-collar work job, or when they're home at 9 o'clock. And that's something that I am reminding my team will not change at the MTA, and I hope others continue to do as well.
That's a fantastic takeaway. It's not just public engagement, but it's meeting people where they are, where they need to be, especially the highest need users. Thank you. Thank you all for these important takeaways. I want to take a moment. I know we have at least one question from the audience, and others can feel free to line up at the microphones if you have others as well.
Sure, thank you everyone. My name is Madeline Zhu from Lacuna Technologies. I want to thank the whole panel. This question is particularly for Commissioner Biagi and Secretary Velez-Vega. I think both of you spoke a lot in your answers about equity, about physical infrastructure, sidewalk and signage and things like that. But especially because we're at CoMotion, I would love for you to say a few words about how you think of digital infrastructure and how that layer intersects with your equity efforts.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, and I was walking around the vendors and we're taking back to the island, we need to do this and that, because we do have, at the digital side, developing a lot of the apps and the technology to improve our mass transportation. For example, in the train, we do now have a system where we're going to improve fare collection. And how can you use it, and how can you purchase it from your phone? How can you see the routes and where you're going to be picked up and where it's going to take you and how long it's going to take you? And that there is an app available now that we haven't launched officially, but it is part of the intermodal of a metro, the urban train. Also with the Metropolitan Bus Authority, we're also working and developing an app as well that can be digitally. When I talked about the bus shelters and having information on the actual bus shelters of where you're going and just showing you the route, there's also going to be a QR code that's going to be audio and also so that people that can't use or that can't see can also be able to receive the information. That's something that we've never had. So we're actually integrating these digital modes into what we have existing. A lot of it has to be developed because we don't have them. For example, what I'm talking about with the bus routes and the maps and just the physical infrastructure of having the routes and the QR code and the technology available is something that we're working on now that we've never had in Puerto Rico. So it's definitely going to be innovative. And there's a lot of it, and there's a lot to go. We definitely need to improve on the digital side of it. The infrastructure also has to be worked on as well, so it has to go hand in hand. Again, we're on recovery mode, so a lot of the infrastructure improvements that we're doing are going along with the digital, and definitely we do have a long way to go there, but we're working on it. I think we're in definitely more of that innovation mindset now in collaboration than what we have in the past.
Yeah, and I think a couple of things. We do talk about it, apps easy to use, this and that, right? But we can't forget folks who are underbanked, who don't have that opportunity. So, for example, our Chicago Transit Authority still enables a storefront ability service to use our bike share. You don't have to have a credit card. We have ways that you can use cash. You can do things in person. So I think it's unpacking some of the assumptions about who's in your service area and what their tools are to engage. I think that matters. I also think, we did talk a lot about engagement, but how do you get people into the room as you're designing these interfaces, right? I think we have a lot of solutions looking for a problem. Maybe we could turn that on its head and say, how do we have some hyper-local design influence on the actual technology itself or what the interface looks like? That could be game-changing. I mean, imagine if there's a way that you're selecting a certain kind of profile associated with how you need to use that system, and you can have that in the same city using the same service where someone else has a different set of characteristics that they can interact with it better. A couple of other things that we're doing, I think, toward being more inclusive, like all of our city digital infrastructure, we're looking to make huge improvements for people who are visually impaired and have other challenges with accessing some of those sites. So, but I think, to my colleague's point, it's a big conversation, and I'm glad that you asked it, because I also think some of the best ideas are probably walking around here today too. It's probably worth having a panel or something to keep that conversation going. So thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was an excellent question. Any other questions from the audience? All right. Well, I want to thank my panelists so much for your fantastic insights. I hope everyone walked away with so many great ideas. I know I did. So thank you, Gia, Eileen, Christian, and Quemuel. Thank you for the audience.